This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 8 and 9 of Seminar 5. Fathers and their sons. I asked a priest one time, why is the relationship of the Trinitarian God with itself framed in terms of a father-son relationship? The obvious response by one who is not in this tradition, and many who are, would be patriarchy. This priest's response was not a classical dogmatic position as one might expect, because this is how God revealed himself to humanity or some such claim. Instead, he said that God aims at healing the weakest link. In other words, the relationship between fathers and their sons is often the most broken of human relationships. In the psychoanalytic tradition, there is an apparent emphasis on fathers and sons as well in terms of the Oedipus complex, and it would seem the reason for this overlap with the priest's response is the following: that the relationship between fathers and their sons is fraught with complications that, on the whole, and not without many exceptions, makes the boy's journey through the Oedipus complex distinctly difficult. Now, it should be added that what we're covering today marks ground we've treaded previously in other videos. And what I've discovered in these repetitions by Lacan, however, is an unfolding of ideas that always add something new, sort of like the need to view an object from multiple angles in order to grasp it in 3 dimensions. And so I'm hoping that even though some of this material is similar to things we've covered before, the way we go about it, in light of how Lacan goes about it, will shed new insights into this complex set of ideas. In the 8th lecture, titled Foreclosure of the Name of the Father, we begin a new section of Seminar 5 concerning the logic of castration. To begin, Lacan reintroduces the concept of the name of the father as a pivotal signifier, and he attributes several crucial functions to it. First, it provides the foundation for true or full speech. True speech concerns a mode of speaking that evokes the unconscious and moves beyond what a subject intends or means when they speak. It's key to psychoanalytic technique, as the analyst is supposedly the one trained to hear this kind of speech. Second, this signifier plays a central role in establishing the entire system of signifiers that structures subjectivity. Signifiers have regular law-governed relations with other signifiers, and in those relations produce signifieds or meanings grounded in a shared discourse. As such, third, the name of the father testifies to the existence of the law and the existence of the signifier itself. What does it mean now to say that the law and signifier exist? In part, it entails the fact that there is a point of reference outside the subject, something other, that the subject recognizes and to a certain extent obeys. The name of the father is a representation of the law that is within the big other. It gives the law its gravity and significance in being that signifier internalized by the subject that allows the subject to recognize the existence of that law outside of it. Lacan then returns to the schema he's been developing in prior lectures and uses it to illustrate a profound insight, that our expression of desire, when communicated through a chain of signifiers, inherently alters the nature of that desire. One of the main points of the schema he develops, and that we've talked about in the initial videos dedicated to the seminar, is to get his audience to visualize the idea that the mere passage of desire as the expression, the high point of the radical ego, through the chain of signifiers introduces an essential change in the dialectic of desire. So, in other words, there's never some ideal primordial moment wherein one finds a perfect identity between the ego's intentions when speaking and the ratification of that speech by another who is in a position to provide satisfaction. And this ratification comes at the price of having one's desire conditioned by the desire of the other. In other words, I always speak my desire through words that are not originally my own and which acquires a meaning that is not entirely what I think I want. This is what Lacan calls the Cuckoldification of Desire. Our desire has always slept with signifiers that find their locus outside the subject and in the other. But to say this, we have to avoid any kind of internal-external duality, as now what we understand is that the most imminent and intimate element of the subjectivity is always already curving back upon the exterior, having originated there and always leading back there. To summarize, the name of the Father is the pivotal signifier that governs other signifiers and establishes the existence of the law. Desire is always a transformed desire shaped by signifiers. Each of these points repeatedly leads us toward an exteriority and otherness, but not an otherness as relative to the sameness of my ego. Instead, we are dealing with the big other, who is always an enigmatic and incomprehensible point of reference for the subject. The other represents the source of the law that governs speech, and the warehouse that stores those signifiers that will be made available to the subject. Finally, the other is the one who is in the position to affirm the subject's speech and to complicate the message, giving meaning to signifiers that exceeds any initial intentions held by the ego of the speaking subject. Lacan then transitions to ask the question, what happens when this critical signifier, the name of the Father, is absent? This was the entire focus of Seminar 3. Without the name of the Father signifier, a disconnect arises between the meaning of signifiers as embodied in a message and the law that dictates how signifiers are ordered and tethered to signifieds. Ordinarily, meaning emerges through the relation of signifiers with other signifiers within an entire network of signifiers, which collectively forms the subject's world. However, without this pivotal signifier, other signifiers become isolated and enigmatic. Messages received by the subject are fragmented and disjointed. They appear as communications from the other, but in a manner that fails to integrate the subject's speech within the law. And a few consequences result from this. First, the subject's speech becomes vague and disjointed in their unregulated production of signifiers, while the message the subject receives from the other, rather than being assumed as their own message, appears alien and strange, manifesting as a hallucinated voice. The subject, confronted with these enigmatic foreign messages, is compelled to ascribe a meaning to them, leading to delusional certainties about the meaning of these messages. In the 9th lecture, entitled The Paternal Metaphor, Lacan focuses on the function of the father and related challenges concerning the Oedipus complex. His consideration of these challenges leads him to raise 3 key questions that have come up from various approaches to Freud's theory. First, what is the connection between the Oedipus complex and neurosis? Lacan suggests that the Oedipus complex can be perceived as the mechanism through which our subjectivity is either normalized or isn't. To be normalized is to have one's sense of self coherently shaped by a symbolic authority. Yet he doesn't dismiss the potential for neurosis to exist independently of the Oedipus complex, and this leads him to propose that there may be both a maternal and paternal superego coexisting, with the former possibly being more oppressive, a point he'll return to later on in the seminar. Second, is there a field of pathology that can be properly considered pre-Oedipal? Problems arising from an unresolved Oedipus complex often lead to neurosis. However, disturbances in reality, like psychosis and even to some degree perversion, are sometimes thought to stem from unresolved pre-Oedipal issues. The challenge with this notion is the way it treats the Oedipus complex in a very linear manner, it being a kind of chronological phase, and thereby neglecting its retroactive implications. For this reason, and he cites Melanie Klein here, we find the father, or the phallus, appearing at earlier and earlier stages of psychic development. In other words, the success or failure of a resolution of the Oedipus complex retroactively leads what preceded this period to acquire different significance, and that this retroactive effect has often been neglected in other theorists. And so, in a certain sense, the pre-Oedipal is always already Oedipalized. Third, what is the Oedipus complex's relationship with genitalization? The Oedipus complex has a normative function, as we've mentioned, and that includes installing the subject's moral structure and relationship to reality. It also includes the process of genitalization, and that entails how subjects assume their own sex, often either as a process of masculinization or feminization. And we'll soon see how the process of genitalization unfolds differently for these two cases. If the Oedipus complex is such a linchpin in shaping our subjectivity, how does the father's role fit into this precisely? Lecture 8 concluded with a consideration of the difference between the name of the father and the real father. While the real father's presence doesn't ensure the name of the father's installation, the real father doesn't need to be present for the latter to be established either. One never knows in what ways the father is deficient, which was illustrated in Seminar 4 through the case of little Hans. As such, it is important to distinguish between the father as normative versus the father as normal. To be normative refers to the father's function as exerting a structuring influence wherein subjects can be firmly planted within the symbolic order. The normal father is merely the actual and typical position a real father holds within a family, especially within Western civilization. So if not a real father, what kind of father is at work here? This is where Lacan claims that the father referred to here functions as a metaphor. Now, what is a metaphor? According to Lacan, a metaphor is when one signifier takes the place of another signifier. Such an exchange, due to the dominance of signifiers over signifieds, has the effect of producing a new meaning. So when I pointed something out to my son when he was an infant, he did not look at the thing I was pointing at, but instead he looked at my hand. The pointing hand acquires the signifier, daddy's hand. As my son got older, something happened in which the signifier, daddy's hand, gets substituted by another signifier. It now is a pointer. Consequently, the meaning also changes. My hand in this instance no longer carries all the significance associated with daddy's hand, but instead its meaning is directed somewhere else. That tree the hand is pointing to, for example. I use this sort of simple example because I think it helps get at the sense of the paternal metaphor that has much more global implications as it involves a more fundamental, primordial signifier that governs all other signifiers. According to Lacan, the mother becomes the child's first signifier, a mother who comes and goes, is perceived and then not perceived. And for the child, the world changes with her arrival and can disappear with her departure. And perhaps we can think about Piaget's idea of object permanence being relevant here. The child produces, or perhaps acquires, a signifier that represents the mother in her absence, thereby allowing the mother to, in a certain sense, exist for the child when she is in reality lacking. For the child, these absences are linked to something the mother desires, which pulls the mother away from the child. The fundamental question, according to Lacan, for the child at this stage is this: what does the mother want? What is this X in her that accounts for her comings and goings and thus accounts for the child's frustrations? The X is the signified of the mother's desire, and the child tries to discern what this imaginary X is. According to Lacan, this imaginary X is the phallus. The imaginary phallus is the term that stands in for what the mother wants and what the child seemingly cannot offer her. But in discerning what this X is, the child tries to make itself into the phallus, which is the source of all sorts of fixations and the basis for the possibility of a perverse subjective structure. The situation also makes evident that this mother is a lacking subject. That is, she does not have what she desires, and so must look for it elsewhere. And while the child tries to become the phallus for the mother, there is the dawning recognition of not being able to provide what the mother is looking for. That in fact, someone offers a bigger and better version of this phallus. This is where we find the imaginary father enters. The imaginary father is the agent of privation who deprives the mother of what she lacks, while also possibly being set up as an ideal. An agent who not only possesses what the mother lacks, but possesses it in a manner that is bigger and better than anything the child can offer. This is a father who is feared and a father who is idealized. And the function of this imaginary father plays a central role as the child continues to progress through the Oedipus complex. First, the child fears retaliation because of its aggressive thoughts and feelings it's had toward this father for being the source of the mother's desire. And that aggression that the child feels is projected onto this imaginary father. And this feared imaginary retaliation can then become symbolized as a fear of castration. Castration, a symbolic act, bears upon this imaginary object of the phallus, which the child fears losing, even though the child never truly had it. The resolution of this Oedipus complex comes when the child learns to love and identify with the father, and to recognize that indeed the father is the one who possesses what is absent from both mother and child. This recognition allows the imaginary phallus to be raised to the level of a signifier of lack. In accepting the inaccessibility of this symbolic phallus, as it is always already absent, the child may then be granted substitute satisfactions, which come only by identifying with the one who does possess it, the one whom the child now loves. Identification is the process by which the child internalizes a signifier that represents the father, the name of the father, that lives in the child as an ego ideal, rather than an idealized ego. And that will henceforth become the pivot around which that child's subjectivity will circulate. Lacan notes that this resolution manifests differently in boys and girls, with boys facing a more intricate path, a difference that accounts for the genitalization that takes place through it. He claims that the path of girls who undergo feminization is a bit more straightforward at this point. In identifying with the father as an ego ideal, she recognizes not having what she in fact doesn't have. The symbolic phallus and thus castration can be more readily accepted in light of the real absence that is already there. The path is more complex for boys, he claims, since the boy must recognize that he does not have the phallus, even though he has a real penis. In other words, there is the need to recognize a lack in the context of an apparent presence. And boys will, as such, be much more inclined than girls to develop a perverse subjectivity that disavows this lack. Despite this difference between boys and girls, it has to be noted that both are castrated, since castration is not something literal, but a symbolic act that takes place on an imaginary object. The real penis, the real father, and indeed even the real mother all provide material support, and there is a need for such support. The big other needs to be embodied by a real individual, and the real penis or absence of one does have a bearing on symbolic and imaginary functions. Yet what is most essential is not the real presence or absence of a particular kind of human being or physical organ, but that the essential functions of their symbolic counterparts find expression regardless of the vessel that materially supports those functions. Wrapping up, Lacan discerns an essential function in the notion of the symbolic father as expressing a desire for something other, something that can establish the basic coordinates for how to navigate reality. We have heard how, without it, there is a radical disruption in the subject's relationship to reality. An additional importance of the symbolic father, one that Lacan does not touch upon here, is that it shows how the phallus, the symbol of power and authority traditionally conferred upon the father, is in fact a farce, in the sense that it is a signifier for what is essentially lacking, not only in the subject, but in the symbolic father itself. The problem then is not a matter of inequity, one has the phallus whereas others do not. The difficulty lies, it would seem to me, in that some are more inclined to cover up their lack in destructive ways, while others more effectively come to terms with their lack, and thereby reducing the inclination to deploy all sorts of deceptive maneuvers and power plays that mask what is a ubiquitous castration. regardless of how we position ourselves vis-a-vis the big other, the fact of the matter is that there is a desire for this other, an other that, through various human formations and collective institutions, structures our desires and determines the satisfactions available to us. And this is what Lacan means here by the term claustration. Claustration entails enclosing oneself within a set of boundaries wherein we gain a sense of psychic security. Such security is tightly connected to fear, which facilitates claustration. Without fear, we would no longer know where the boundaries are, and this lack of boundaries would expose us to anxiety, a far more threatening and disorienting affect. This is what we see in the case of little Hans, wherein in place of an initially deficient father, a substitute signifier is manufactured that serves as a means for containing his anxiety, and that manifests symptomatically as a phobia. This phobia tells him where to go and where to avoid. It provides a temporary GPS guidance system that serves as a stopgap before the paternal metaphor can fully take hold. And even then, it would seem that we incessantly hoist phobic objects all around us all the time that from an outside observer can often look like an excessive attempt at exerting control over one's life and over others. The security of claustration is also connected to boredom. Boredom requires both a predictable structure and a desire for variation. Boredom structures desire to aim at symbolically sanctioned distractions. Thus, in a certain sense, it would seem we require boredom to articulate what we want. As Lacan puts it, we are happy to eat shit, but not always the same shit. If you got something from this video, do consider liking, sharing, and if you haven't already, subscribing. And if you would like to support this work even more, there's the super thanks button below. And you can also be a regular supporter over on Patreon, where I offer video transcripts, unedited materials, and prioritize questions and comments here on YouTube. The link is below. And I would like to thank the following for being amazing supporters of this work, and very grateful for the commitment they've made and to see that this channel continues to grow and become what I think it can be. Thank you for watching, and until next time, be well.